Lesson 24. Prophecy by Symbolic Actions Part 8. Make the Chain. Scripture reading, Ezekiel chapter 7 verses 23 to 27. Introduction. God commanded the prophet Ezekiel to make a chain. Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 23 says, "Make the chain, for the land is full of bloody crimes and the city is full of violence." This chain is made by linking iron loops. It takes quite a long time to make this chain because it requires a repeated process of placing iron into the fire, molding it into the shape of a loop, and joining it to other loops. The word chain derives from the Hebrew word rathak, which means to bind. The prophet Ezekiel would have needed lots of chains in order to bind his whole body. In this lesson, we will examine in detail the 8th prophecy by symbolic action. Number 1. Meaning of the symbolic action. God had the prophet Ezekiel make a chain to show how the Israelites would be chained and taken into Babylonian captivity. Hence, Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 24 says, "Therefore, I'll bring the worst of the nations, and they will possess their houses. I will also make the pride of the strong ones cease, and their holy places will be profaned." And indeed, King Zedekiah was chained and taken captive. 2 Kings chapter 25 verse 7 records, "They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, then put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him with bronze fetters, and brought him to Babylon." The prophet Jeremiah was also chained and taken captive. Jeremiah chapter 40 verse 1 says, "The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord after Nebuzaradan, captain of the bodyguard, had released him from Ramah, when he had taken him bound in chains among all the exiles of Jerusalem and Judah who were being exiled to Babylon." Number 2. The reason they were taken away chained. First, because of bloody crimes. Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 23 says, "Make the chain, for the land is full of bloody crimes and the city is full of violence." Here, the word crimes is mishpat in Hebrew and is used to mean justice, case, or verdict. This is speaking of how they shed many people's blood by receiving bribes and giving unjust judgments at the court. Isaiah chapter 10 verse 2 says, "So as to deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor of my people of their rights, so that widows may be their spoil and that they may plunder the orphans." Song of Solomon chapter 3 verses 35 to 36 also says, "To deprive a man of justice in the presence of the Most High, to defraud a man in his lawsuit. Of these things the Lord does not approve." Second, because they were full of violence. The latter half of Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 23 says, "The city is full of violence." Here, the word violence is chamas in Hebrew and means physical violence. In the book of Ezekiel, violence is a great sin that provokes God. Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 17 says, "He said to me, 'Do you see this, son of man? Is it too light a thing for the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they have committed here, that they have filled the land with violence and provoked me repeatedly? For behold, they are putting the twig to their nose.'" And Ezekiel chapter 28 verse 16 says, "By the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore, I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire." One of the reasons for God's judgment during Noah's time was the fullness of violence. Genesis chapter 6 verse 11 says, "Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence." Third, because of pride. Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 24 says, "Therefore I will bring the worst of the nations, and they will possess their houses. I will also make the pride of the strong ones cease, and their holy places will be profaned." Here, the word pride is gaon in Hebrew, and is originally a word that is used to express God's terror and majesty. But it was used to describe people because they had stolen God's glory. The saints of this world must never commit the prideful sin of stealing God's glory.